This week we will explore the related topics of strategic air power and submarine warfare. You may be wondering how these two could be related. After all, one has to do with naval operations and one has to do with aviation. But there are actually quite a few connections between them, even purely from a thematic perspective, as far as our main course themes are concerned. They both relate closely to the themes of total war, as well as technology in wartime. A third theme that they relate to would be, of course, strategic decision making. Now, if we had more time, I would have liked to do a side by side comparison of the use of strategic air power during the First World War and the Second World War. But we don't have time, and the fact of the matter is that strategic air power was used only to a limited degree during the First World War, because the technology was not yet advanced enough to make it especially practical. So I'm going to leave you with the Nyberg textbook, where you can learn about the broad outlines of strategic air power in the First World War. I'm trusting you to read that on your own, and I'm going to focus instead on the Second World War experience for this part of the lecture, because the role that strategic air power played during the Second World War was significantly beyond what it achieved in the First World War, and therefore it had much greater consequences for how the war was fought, and how the war ultimately was brought to an end. Probably it would help to begin with some definitions. What does strategic air power actually mean? This is a very particular set of terms that we're using. And in simplest form, we can define strategic air power as the use of long-range aircraft. Normally, we're talking about long-range aircraft to challenge civilian morale and destroy or damage infrastructure in the enemy's homeland. So, to put it another way, when we use aircraft to attack the enemy's homeland, in particular civilians, directly, rather than the enemy's armed forces on the battlefield, we're talking about strategic air power. If we were to use the term tactical air power, we would be referring instead to the use of air forces to directly attack the enemy's armies or other military forces. So this is the main distinction between strategic air power and tactical air power. Tactical air power normally operates at relatively shorter ranges than strategic air power. So the implications or the experiences of strategic air power during the First World War would have a far-reaching impact on how people would plan for the possibility of a strategic bombing or a strategic air attack during the interwar period. And this is a little bit paradoxical, because there was a very limited use of strategic air power during the First World War, mainly because the technology was, aviation technology that is, had still not matured to the point where it was especially useful for delivering heavy loads of ordnance over top of enemy cities. Nevertheless, the precedent was set for attacking enemy cities with aircraft during the First World War, and once the precedent was set, we find that during the interwar period, military theorists, especially those who have direct involvement in air forces, begin to imagine how the next big conflict might be shaped by air power, particularly by the 1930s when aviation technology has matured to the point where aircraft are quite capable of delivering heavy loads of bombs over cities that could be many hundreds of miles away from where the aircraft are based. Now, a great deal was written about strategic air theory during the interwar period, during the 1920s and 1930s. But one of the most important thinkers and writers about strategic air power during that time frame was an Italian army officer named Giulio Douhet, who lived from the 1860s up until 1930. So he never actually lived to see the Second World War, but based on his experience in the First World War, he had a lot of ideas about how long-range aircraft might play a role in the next large conflict. And he discussed these ideas in an important book called The Command of the Air. And basically, Douhet, who had lived through the First World War as an Italian army officer, saw how much difficulty that armies had fighting decisive battles on the ground, and how heavy the casualties often were. And he imagined that in the future, that sort of agonizing slaughter on the ground, on the conventional battlefield, could simply be bypassed altogether and avoided by attacking the enemy's home front, civilian population, and infrastructure. And while that may seem equally as inhumane on the surface of things, the idea was that it would probably lead to a shorter conflict because of the degree of damage that could be inflicted, which would simply be intolerable to the enemy's government. So once again, we see here, as we saw earlier in the course, the supposition that technology would invariably, through its destructive capacity, would invariably make the next war a short war, which would be fought quickly and decisively. And what we're going to find is that, once again, this was not an entirely accurate assumption or set of assumptions. Yes, strategic air power would be used. Yes, it would do a lot of damage. No, it would not be immediately decisive. No, it would not lead to a shorter war necessarily. And no, it would not avoid heavy fighting on the ground, as had been seen during the First World War. So this type of thinking, in any case, tended to some degree at least, percolate into popular understanding of what air power might be all about in the next conflict. And in particular, as I mentioned, I think last week in the Artifact of the Week slideshow, there was an especial fear that air forces would be used to deliver chemical weapons that would be highly damaging against unprotected civilian populations. But what ends up happening, in fact, is not that air forces use chemical weapons in the Second World War. There's very limited use of chemical weapons in the Second World War compared to the First. But that doesn't really matter because it's conventional bombs which are going to do a great deal of damage during the Second World War without any need for chemical attacks. So, on one hand, popular understanding was correct that air forces may do far-reaching damage to civilian populations and cities and infrastructure, but the methods by which that damage would be done were different than was widely imagined. So we're going to begin by looking at early British and German approaches to long-range bombing. And then ultimately we have to include the Americans as well. I don't want to give the impression, though, that these are the only three countries that are involved in strategic bombing during the Second World War, because that would not be entirely accurate. So I'm assuming that students will have read the chapter in the Parker textbook which explores strategic bombing in greater detail. And because of time constraints, I have to sort of um, keep the analysis in the lecture relatively limited. So, looking at the British and German approaches at the outset of the war, in 1939 and early 1940, the British, although they were equipped with a strategic air force and they were using their air force to attack German military targets, avoided civilian targets or built up areas because naturally they didn't want to invite retaliation in kind from the German Air Force. And for the time being, the Germans followed more or less the same approach when it came to the British. However, in the early campaigns of the war, the Germans were not reluctant to use their air force to make strategic attacks against other enemies. For example, during the Polish campaign, the German Air Force very heavily bombed Warsaw, not because of any specific military importance, but to try to pressure the Polish government to capitulate as early as possible. And they did likewise during the 1940 campaign in the Netherlands, where a very, very heavy bombing attack was launched against the Dutch city of Rotterdam, doing far-reaching damage. And again, the intent here was not to strike any particular military target, but rather to terrorize Dutch civilians and force the government to capitulate as early as possible. And in this instance, it was effective. But the direction of the strategic air war really began to change by the middle of 1940 and during the later part of 1940. And this was due in part to the outcome of the Battle of Britain. And let me step back and remind us of a little bit of context here. We already know that by the end of June 1940, that the French government had capitulated and negotiated separate peace terms with the Germans. Following this decision, we also know that the British decided not to negotiate any kind of terms with Germany, and Britain and its empire, including the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and then also India, and so forth, decided to fight on alone. So the Germans, as most international observers expected they would do, started to plan for an invasion of the United Kingdom. And this was likely to be an amphibious invasion, a seaborne invasion that would also include the dropping of airborne soldiers by parachute or by glider. And the Germans even had a code name for the invasion plan of the United Kingdom. It was to be called Operation Sea Lion. But in order for Operation Sea Lion to have any chance of success, the Germans would first have to neutralize Britain's two preliminary lines of defense. And these were the Royal Navy, which was still a formidable force in 1940, and also the Royal Air Force, in particular, the branch of the Royal Air Force known as Fighter Command. Fighter Command mainly operated single-engine, single-seat, high-speed fighter aircraft, like the Spitfire or the Hurricane, which would be used to harass any kind of German attempt to cross the English Channel or to drop paratroops or so forth. But the first priority for the Germans was to get rid of the Royal Air Force, because if the Royal Air Force was neutralized, the Royal Navy would be highly vulnerable because it would lack any kind of air protection. If the Germans controlled the skies, their chances of undertaking a successful invasion of the United Kingdom would increase substantially. And so unfolded during the summer of 1940 the Battle of Britain, which in summary was an attempt by the German Air Force to destroy the fighting capacity of RAF Fighter Command. And without going into any detail, the Germans failed to